family is right here. There are two domestic slave quarter buildings that are constructed out of completely different materials. So there's a clear material differentiation on this plantation between where the planters would have been living and how the planters would have been living and how the slaves would have been living. And then on the sort of to the north of the house is a more industrial area that becomes redeveloped later on as a residence. And so there's a very rich series of occupation here. But it's clear when the planters decided how they wanted their plantation to look, they were drawing on models that they had seen before elsewhere. This is a very typical, in some ways, idea of how a plantation should look. In terms of what it is we found, Polly Hill was very artifact rich. Few things. The first two sort of on the top, almost all of the dietary remains we found related to the consumption of shellfish. So these planters and their slaves are not developing resources in terms of boats for fishing. They're not getting out onto the reefs to do that type of exploitation. They're exploiting resources, marine resources, you'd be a fool not to, that are relatively close to where it is they're living. It also suggests, if you look in the center here, that the plantation seems to have been furnished all in one fell swoop. These people bring a large amount of artifacts with them. I'm sure they took a lot of them when they left and came back to Nassau, but there's not a lot of evidence for continued replenishment of supplies over the life of this plantation, certainly very early on. And one of the things that really points to this planter abandonment is that lots of things that you would expect to find on a plantation is simply missing. Things like sewing kits, smoking pipes, the things that people would have used in their daily lives. A dish breaks, you leave it, but you're taking all the things with you that would fill up your daily life. So it looks a little different than some plantations. There's also some evidence. This here is creamware. This dates from about 1760. So this was probably actually a family heirloom that would have been brought by the planters initially. Doesn't date to the period, it wasn't manufactured in the period that people were on the plantation. So we can say something about that the planters furnished this plantation and then they kind of moved away. And what's really interesting, though, is for us was what happened is seemingly as soon as the planters left, which we believe is around 1810, based on the artifacts at Polly Hill. The first thing is that you would expect, I would expect, if somebody abandons a really big house that has a really nice vantage point, that has a great breeze, you'd move on in. Nobody else is there using it, they're gone. They don't. Nobody moves into the Manor House. And this is a pattern that island residents in the 1970s talked to Kathy Gerace about, that nobody moved into these manor houses. They stayed living in their cabins, the slave cabins that were built according to African design. They didn't move out of them. They didn't want the bigger house. What we did find, interestingly enough, were two very carefully buried bird skulls at one end of the building. Now, people told Kathy Gerace that they used at Sandy Point Plantation, that this became a community place, a space of spiritual activity, a place of worship, and nobody eats bird skulls. There's no meat. That's not a food remain archaeologically. It's something else. People are choosing to take them there, put them there. The building's being reused for something very different after the planters leave. So there's already, you could say, a certain amount of freedom. This kind of expression would have not been, you couldn't have gone to the big house and said, we'd like to do this type of thing here. It had to take place after the planters left. We also find evidence that the buildings that were built very clearly for British and American, depending on how you'd like to think about sort of when people are coming in, and in the case of Farquarson, Scottish people. Once these plantations are abandoned, it seems that they're no longer using the buildings in exactly the same way they were intended. So the top picture is the fireplace from Sandy Point Plantation. The bottom is from Polly Hill Plantation. So we chose the upper one because it's a nice example of an intact sort of fireplace, gives you the idea of what a kitchen should look like, and on the bottom is what ours looked like. It's nowhere near as pretty. But what happened was, it's really clear that they start using the outside of the buildings for cooking, not the inside. So rather than using the fireplaces to cook European-style dishes, they're building fireplaces both in the side of their own residence. The best vantage point to view their plantation lands It's a very distinct looking building. It's made of a tabby. It's a very smooth, carefully constructed building. The kitchen for the plants is at the highest point of the plantation. It suggests a certain status and position of the family. It gives them the best breezes. The active yard is mapped here. Okay, so this gives you some sort of a sense. What you see is the Manor House, different types of economic areas and spaces for people to live. And this central area that's labeled as pieces, this is on one of the buildings, and here in the corner of this building, and they're doing the cooking outside in an African style. So they're changing the way that they're cooking and using these plantation buildings. So it's not long after the planters leave that there seems to be modification. Interestingly, their diet doesn't show much of a change, and it's pretty clear they're not getting very much new stuff. There's probably evidence for 2 new plates in this entire period showing up somehow at Polly Hill Plantation. They're reusing and reusing and reusing these artifacts. They're also doing some things to change the plantation. So one of the phenomena that seems to be occurring at a lot of these plantations, and it's something that I've been working on, that's a totally different talk, but it's the drawings of these ships inside and onside of buildings that seems to be a type of reclaiming of the buildings, a symbolic engagement with the buildings and marking them as belonging to a new community. They're not British, they're not the owners anymore, these are our buildings and they mean something to us. They're also planting, we had a student who did a really interesting survey of the vegetation, the remnant vegetation, and outside of all the planter buildings, lingam vitae trees are being planted and growing in and around these buildings. They're not growing anywhere else on the plantation, so it's fairly deliberate. So she did a comparison thing. And lingam vitae now on the out islands, you would plant in front of a new house to ensure the life and health of the owner. So it's actually something it's a continuing tradition. So they'd also suggest that there are some symbolic ways, not just actual practice ways, that people were changing the way they understood this British designed landscape. What we then have is what's possibly a hiatus in occupation and a reoccupation at Polly Hill in 1870. And they're moving into what was originally the plantation office. There's a fair, and the building at the time is replastered, it's repainted, there's a whole new suite of artifacts brought in. So it's a dramatic change in how the plantation is being used. It's very different and a clear break from the plantation period in every way. It also seems to have been a fairly prosperous household, certainly in the 20th century part of its occupation, which ends right around 1930 according to the artifacts. They had electricity. There was a generator, they had records, there were some like 78 records in pieces, not what you expect to find after you've sort of hacked through all this vegetation to find an abandoned building and they're like records, what is this doing here? But they did, they clearly were able to electrify and have some access to these things in the buildings. But things start to really change during this later occupation that we don't see during the first. They build new buildings. And what they did is they built this, it's relatively hard to see in here, I'm sorry you can't see it better, but it's behind the office building. It's right here. They built a brand new kitchen. And the brand new kitchen, if you measure it, is the same distance from the house and the same orientation as all of the traditional family homes on San Salvador. We went to people and asked if we could measure their kitchens that are behind their house, and the distance matches. So here we have in 1930 something that looks very much like the house lots that people are choosing to build all over the island in the 20th century. Starting to look Bahamian, right? Looks like a Bahamian house lot. You also see a change in diet. So if during the period of slavery and just afterwards during emancipation, these people are eating shellfish as their primarily archaeologically identifiable diet, they certainly are eating other things that we just can't see. All of a sudden you have chicken, you have goats, you have shellfish, you have wild birds, you have a whole different dietary profile showing up in the archaeological record. Things that oral histories and contemporary island residents tell you was their diet throughout the 20th century. So it's interesting that during the plantation period and immediately after, you're not seeing these changes to things that look like contemporary 20th century Bahamian and 21st century Bahamian out-island life. It's happening actually in the late 19th century. And that's really sort of why we've been looking at these bigger changes. The other thing that we found that was interesting is that the out-islands were often called terra incognita, unknown lands, because there's such little historical documentation. Farquarson's Journal is an exception to that. The O'Brien papers, which John will mention, are an exception to that.